Rise of the Ronin for some reason wasn't really on my radar in the lead up to its launch, which is weird because on paper it has so many things I love in a game, and it shares many similarities with some of my favorite games ever, like Ghost of Tsushima, the Assassin's Creed series, and the Souls-like games. I don't really know how it fell under my radar, but after seeing some videos on it not too long after it came out, I felt very compelled to play it, and I'm glad I did. Rise of the Ronin was developed by Team Ninja, a Japanese-based studio responsible for making Ninja Gaiden, the Neo games, and more recently, Wo Long Fallen Dynasty. And I had never actually played a Team Ninja game before. Rise of the Ronin was my first one, and from what I understand, this game was quite ambitious and different from some of their previous work, being their first open world game, and on top of that being published by Sony. Likely due to 2024 being a barren year for Sony first-party titles, they wanted to still have some exclusives this year, and so they decided to publish some third-party titles like Rise of the Ronin. But you can tell this game must have been a massive undertaking for Team Ninja. It had been in development since 2015, about 9 years. The game is huge, far bigger than I was expecting, and it's their first open world title. With such an ambitious and different game for the studio, there's bound to be some issues, but overall, I really enjoyed this game. It got a lot of hate and negative reviews on its launch, which I don't quite understand. The game certainly has its fair share of issues, which we'll talk about, but overall, I still found it to be a very fun game. It's not a masterpiece by any means, and it being compared to the likes of Ghost of Tsushima isn't doing the game many favors, but a game doesn't need to be a masterpiece for it to be an enjoyable experience and worth your time. I've seen some people say it's a really solid 7 to 8 out of 10 game, and I tend to agree with that. There's nothing wrong with that, and because the game doesn't live up to something like Ghost of Tsushima, which it was never going to, doesn't make it a bad game. And knowing that a lot of my subscribers are Assassin's Creed fans, as that's the series I talk about the most on my channel, I think a lot of them would really enjoy this game. And I not only recommend it to Assassin's Creed fans, I recommend it in general. Now, whether or not it's worth $70 is up to you, I'll let you judge that for yourself. Getting this game on sale further down the line may be a great idea, as I think as more time passes, more people will come to realize how overlooked this game was on its launch. Although it of course being a PS5 exclusive doesn't make it very accessible to a lot of people, and it's unclear when this game is coming to PC, but I imagine it would eventually, as most PlayStation exclusives do these days. Regardless, Rise of the Ronin really surprised me. I did not expect to enjoy it as much as I did, especially with all the negativity surrounding it initially, but after putting over 70 hours into it, I had no regrets. It really has been a big year for Samurai Media. Along with Rise of the Ronin, we got the Ghost of Tsushima PC port, Assassin's Creed Shadows comes out later this year, and we even got the surprise hit Shogun TV series. As a longtime Assassin's Creed fan who always wanted a game set in Japan, to suddenly be bombarded by not only Shadows, but also Ghost of Tsushima on PC and now Rise of the Ronin within the same year feels incredibly gratifying. We've basically gotten 3 Assassin's Creed Japan games in 1 year. Okay, technically not, but you catch my meaning. I've even seen Rise of the Ronin be described as Team Ninja's Assassin's Creed fanfiction, and while this game is certainly its own thing, there are some similarities. In terms of open world design, the stealth, and even some of the story would fit an AC game very well. Which is why I think Assassin's Creed fans specifically would really enjoy this game. It's kind of like if Assassin's Creed, Ghost of Tsushima, and Sekiro had a slightly deformed baby. Okay, wow, where am I going with this? It sounds really weird, but if you play the game, you likely know what I mean. However, even though it does share similarities with those games, there are some key differences. For one, the time period. This game, unlike Ghost of Tsushima and the upcoming Assassin's Creed Shadows, does not take place in feudal Japan. Ghost of Tsushima is set during the 13th century, Shadows is set in the 16th century, and Rise of the Ronin takes place in the 19th century at the end of the Edo period and during the Bakumatsu period, a time of great unrest, turmoil, and transition in Japan, as it opened its borders to the Western world, sparking lots of conflict and bringing the time of the Tokugawa shogunate to a close. Team Ninja wanted to set their game during this time, as they felt it was an era many video games would shy away from, given its dark and tumultuous history. I love the choice of setting, it makes for a phenomenal premise, and it's not as commonly known or depicted like the earlier times of the samurai and shinobi. And as such, the game begins in 1853 as American Commodore Matthew Perry arrives in Japan to re-establish trade between Japan and the Western world, forcing it to open its borders. We play as a member of the Veiled Edge, a secret group of nameless assassins who work in the dark to serve the light. Members of the Veiled Edge are trained and raised as blade twins, who are shown to be very close and like two sides of the same sword. At the start of the game, you'll get to customize and create your blade twins through the game's character creator. Here you'll get a deep selection of customization options, from faces to hairstyles, tattoos, size, and even voice. Although picking your voice doesn't really matter all that much, considering your protagonist will rarely ever speak. I'll get more into that later. All in all though, it's a surprisingly deep and robust character creator that allows you to personalize and fine-tune both characters to look how you want, even if it doesn't look very historically accurate for the time, as I made my blade twin counterpart look like an anime villain. But once that's done, you'll choose your blade sharpening origins, which one form, what kind of build and playstyle you want to go for in combat, and pick which of your two blade twins you want to play the prologue with. You then learn the game's basic combat mechanics and are sent with your blade twin to Commodore Perry's black ship to assassinate him and prevent the Americans from reaching Japan's harbors. However, before you can kill him, a mysterious man referred to as the Blue Demon appears, and in an attempt to escape, you must choose which blade twin you want to play as for the entirety of your playthrough, while the other one sacrifices themselves and stays behind to cover your escape. It's sort of like a Dishonored 2 style twist, where you must choose who you want to play the game with at the start, while the other character will be captured. Or maybe think of it as something similar to AC Odyssey as well, where you must choose between playing as Alexios and Cassandra, while the other you don't choose will serve a different role in the story. But with your blade twin captured, you defect from the Veiled Edge and set off on your own to find your blade twin at any cost. And that's Rise of the Ronin's opening. It's a very strong, very intriguing opening, it sets up the game and the premise really well. Unfortunately, the story loses a lot of steam past this opening, but it was a strong setup to get the player invested and motivated with a simple goal of finding and rescuing your blade twin. Now, let's address Rise of the Ronin's elephant in the room: the visuals. One of, if not the main reason this game was getting a lot of hate on its launch was the graphics. Honestly, I'm not someone who really cares all that much about graphics. Having extraordinary graphics is nice to have, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't make or break the experience for me. If I'm going to put hours upon hours into a game, it isn't for the graphics. And Rise of the Ronin really does not look bad. Yes, when put up to a Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon, or another Sony first-party title, it pales in comparison, but the game looks fine. It even still looks really good in some areas, I'd argue. The character models and level of detail is good, the cities in particular feel immersive. YouTube compression probably doesn't help matters much, but this game by no means looks bad to me. Though, from what I understand, graphics were never Team Ninja's strong suit to begin with. But if I were deciding whether or not to play games based on graphics, my selection of games would be very limited. I do wish there was some more NPC density, especially in the cities. It can feel a bit barren and empty at times, and performance can be inconsistent in the more graphically demanding areas, with frame drops being not too uncommon. It was never too egregious for me, but you would hope that wouldn't be an issue with how the game looks. They have fixed this though quite significantly through patches, and I'm very much looking forward to how this game will look and run once it eventually launches on PC. Also, I have to say, this game's cutscene presentation is literally better than the new Assassin's Creed games. I'm not joking, I wish I was. This game's main story cutscenes look phenomenal. The character models, animation, choreography, the camera work and cinematography. It's miles better than most of the cutscenes we've gotten from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Valhalla, and Mirage. I'll talk more about this when I get more into the story, but I don't know if that's really good for Rise of the Ronin or really pathetic for Assassin's Creed. Perhaps both. But like I said, if you're playing Rise of the Ronin, it's not for the graphics, it's mostly for this game's bread and butter, the combat. Combat is this game's magnum opus. It's clearly Team Ninja's biggest strength, and oh does it shine bright here in Rise of the Ronin. The combat is definitely most resemblant of a Souls-like. You have a stamina bar, which is called ki in this game, plenty of melee and ranged weapons, an importance on dodging, blocking, and parrying, healing and stat bolstering items, a checkpoint system, and a heavy emphasis on boss fights and difficulty. However, difficulty in Rise of the Ronin is a bit more flexible than you would typically see in a Souls game. You get 3 difficulty options, Dawn, Dusk, and Twilight, along with an additional harder difficulty, Midnight, when you complete the game, which makes the game a bit more accessible to those who may not want to play on harder difficulties. I personally chose Twilight because in games like this, I really enjoy the loop of difficulty, with being thrown into the fire, and having to quickly learn and adapt through making mistakes and plenty of deaths, which happened a lot at first. This game was very difficult for me when I started, however, as I got more comfortable with it, built up that muscle memory, and learned the specific timings of the mechanics and created my own build and playstyle, the game became significantly easier. I believe I died more in the first 10 hours than I did in the next 60. As soon as the combat really began to click for me and I understood what was really strong in this game, Twilight difficulty really wasn't so difficult. Although I did feel like there was a pretty significant late game difficulty spike in the last couple hours. But really what made the combat click for me was figuring out the game's counterspark mechanic and the best times to use it. Countersparking is this game's equivalent of parrying, and these kinds of games have conditioned my brain to spam and go for parries whenever possible, and that will not be an effective strategy in Rise of the Ronin, as counterspark can also be an attack if mistimed, since they are both bound to the triangle button. So if you miss the timing for it, your character is going to do an attack that leaves you completely exposed and drains your ki. This was clearly an intentional choice by Team Ninja, as it makes countersparking a high risk but high reward move. And so spamming counterspark can work on some enemies, but on most it'll likely drain up your ki and you'll end up taking loads of damage, which is why it's important to know when to counterspark as well, because only during unblockable attacks and the end of an enemy's attack chain can you actually leave them panicked and stunned after a counterspark. Pulling this off successfully will recharge your ki and leave them open to attack. It takes a little while to realize, but once that clicked for me, the combat felt significantly easier, as I was dodging and blocking too and not constantly going for a counterspark. The other part that made the combat easier as I progressed were some of the overpowered tools and attacks at my disposal. Outside of your regular combos and attack chains, you also get martial skills, which you can use at will so long as you have the ki for it. And these will differ depending on which weapon and stance you're using. Some of them are extremely strong and will melt enemies. Pair that with paralytic whetstones, stat boosting remedies, and the ki blaze you get as you progress in the game, which is sort of like an ultimate ability that gives you an unlimited amount of ki for a temporary period of time, and you can rinse people. I very quickly discovered that I could just spam one of my martial skills endlessly once I had my ki blaze, and it would melt enemy boss health bars. Not to mention, once you get really stacked up on medicinal pills to the point where you almost always have 10 at your disposal, the combat can become fairly easy. That's the thing about Rise of the Ronin, it has a lot of overpowered stuff you can abuse, but I wouldn't necessarily say this is a bad thing, as it's incredibly fun to do so, and really feels like the ultimate power fantasy. It's marked even more satisfying by how much I was struggling at the beginning to then just becoming near unstoppable. Although, don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of difficult late game fights, but that difficulty doesn't hamper the power fantasy. If you love games that give you a massive power trip and make you feel like a combat demon, this game is most certainly for you. Especially with all the incredibly satisfying and exceptionally brutal combat animations. That's another thing, this game has incredible animations across the board, but especially in combat. Every weapon type has unique attacks and combat finishers, some stances even have unique finishers of their own. In terms of brutality, variety, and overall satisfaction, Rise of the Ronin has some of the best combat animations I've seen in a long time. The combats can be so deep and varied as well. There's a lot of weapon types in this game, each with their own unique stances that play differently. Each has a different attack string and martial skills. You can really tailor your weapons and stances to fit your own playstyle and power fantasy. I really love the ninja shinobi fantasy, so I was rocking a katana with the shinobi stances and the dual swords. But there's so many other ways you can play. There are great swords, spears, odachi, oxtail blades. It's been really cool to see different players' builds and playstyles, and the combat being this deep and varied offers a lot of replay value as well. In a sort of similar way to Ghost of Tsushima, different stances are effective against different enemy types. This is marked by the blue or red arrows that appear on the stances or next to enemy health bars, and for a while I would switch stances depending on the enemy, but eventually I realized whether it was effective or not against a particular enemy didn't really matter much. Your own skill and mastery of a stance is far more important, as even if the stance is ineffective, you can still easily deal damage. In fact, the shinobi stances, which I mainly used, are considered ineffective against everything and are built around counter-sparking, yet I could still dominate with them and they were my favorite stances to use. It's far better to use a stance that has a better attack chain and martial skills than just whatever is considered effective against a particular enemy. Rise of the Ronin also has a unique way of regaining stamina, or ki. As you hit and deal damage to an enemy, you'll build up your blood gauge, and if you hit R1 after an attack, you'll flick the blood off your blade, thus regenerating some of your ki. It's a unique and stylish way of doing it, and I came to really like the system, awarding you for having successful attack chains so that you can quickly regain your ki and keep up the pressure on an enemy without worrying about running out. And if you hold the sheath input after combat, you get some incredible chiburi animations that are unique depending on the weapon type. Dare I say these are better than Ghost of Tsushima's, and I love that game's blood wiping animations. Like I said, animations across the board in this game are so good. During many main story missions, you can even bring along and control some allies, which you'll get to select from the various characters you'll meet and establish bonds with throughout the game. Or you can play these missions online in co-op. Yes, there is co-op in this game, though only for these linear missions. You can't play co-op in the open world or for any side content. But still, that's a pretty impressive feat. I didn't get the chance to try co-op during my playthrough, but having the AI allies is pretty cool, as you can switch between and play as any of them on the fly. They're especially useful in the boss fights, since they can distract and take the aggro off of you, and revive your character with a medicinal pill if you die. Speaking of boss fights, a lot of them are very fun. Most of the main story bosses can be pretty challenging, they have a lot of unique movesets and designs. The mission structure can be a bit repetitive, as most of them entail killing a certain number of enemies or locating someone, and then it ends in a boss fight. However, this never really bothered me too much, as the core gameplay experience is so much fun, and I never got tired of a good boss fight. I will say though, the amount of times the boss fight ends up being an ally, or doesn't really make any sense within the context of the story, is a bit absurd, and it's clear that they just want each mission to end with a boss fight, so a lot of the circumstances for these fights can feel a bit shoehorned in. Good examples of this are allies suddenly wanting to test your skills in combat, so that's a boss fight. Or there was this one mission where I had to deliver a letter to this guy, who I was on friendly terms with, by the way. He was actually an ally, but for some reason the game had me go through his camp, kill a bunch of his foot soldiers, and then fight him in a boss fight, only to just deliver him the letter right after the fight. Like, surely my character could have said something from the beginning, that I'm just here to deliver a letter, and we could have avoided all this very unnecessary bloodshed. Again, this guy was an ally of mine, so it's clear a lot of the time the story is just a pretext to have these boss fights. It's pretty hard to feel any emotional weight or stakes to these kinds of fights, because it doesn't really make sense why you're fighting, and you know no consequence is going to come of it. They are fun fights though, which is clearly the priority, and there are still plenty of emotionally charged fights that actually do have some stakes. This game also has a lot of destructible objects and environments, which is a really nice touch, and can look super cinematic during boss fights. It's clear combat is where Team Ninja excels in gameplay, and it's so good that it can make you look past a lot of the game's shortcomings. Although stealth in Rise of the Ronin really surprised me, in a good way. I was not expecting a lot out of stealth in this type of game, considering in most Souls-like, stealth is either very limited or non-existent, but stealth in Rise of the Ronin has a surprising amount of depth. It's still not what I would consider a stealth game, and it's not as in-depth as something you'd see in some of the Assassin's Creed games or other stealth-heavy game series, but what's here is still really fun. You'll often be given a chance to use stealth in main missions and when clearing outposts, and it's very beneficial to do so, as you can instantly assassinate almost every enemy except for the bosses and formidable foes. Stealth serves as a great way to thin the herd and eliminate a lot of the difficulty you'll have in combat later on. The animations look great. I wish there were a couple more to spice up the variety, but a good looking assassination animation goes a long way in keeping stealth fresh. And with air assassinations, grappling hook, and glider assassinations all being possible, it opens up a lot of potential for unique kills in stealth. This game also has an incredible fear system. Honestly, one of the better implementations of fear I've seen in a game like this. As if enemies see a dead body, or witness you kill one of their comrades, it will panic them and leave them open for assassination, even if they've spotted you already. This makes multi-assassinations and chaining together kills possible, and it's incredibly fun to pull off successfully.
Prohibited goods. I'm offended.
There's many other ways outside of simple assassinations to deal with enemies as well. You have silent projectile weapons like the bow, although sometimes the rifle can even work as a stealthy option. The earthenware balls can be used as a lure, and when upgraded can also be used as firebombs to take out groups of enemies instantly. Stun bombs can also be acquired. You'll get a detector from Igashichi that effectively functions as this game's version of Eagle Vision, where you can spot enemies through solid walls and surfaces. The game allows you to take a non-lethal approach to stealth as well by unequipping your weapons. For those who may want to do an unarmed build, pacifist run, or it's particularly useful when a mission's optional extra objective is to not kill anyone. Stealth can provide a major advantage in Rise of the Ronin when used effectively, and it offered a lot more depth than I was expecting. And paired with some really fun movement and traversal mechanics, it far surpassed any expectation I had for it. Which, if you're anything like me who loves stealth games, especially you fellow Assassin's Creed fans, that's music to the ears. Movement and traversal mechanics generally feel really good in this game too. Like almost every game set in Japan now, you have a grappling hook, similar to how it works in Sekiro. You can use it to throw objects at enemies. You get a special assassination that allows you to pull people towards you with the grappling hook, which looks awesome and is incredibly useful for picking off enemies without being seen from above. You get a glider very early on in the game that can be upgraded and improved to go faster and use less ki. It makes movement and traversal fast, while also giving it good depth. There's a lot of cool things you can do with the glider. You can drop down and assassinate from it, you can whistle and land on your horse while gliding, which feels incredibly smooth and seamless. There are quite a few dense cities to traverse in this game that are designed to let you travel by glider. It just feels really good to use, and it opens up so much creativity in terms of the game's movement and even stealth. You then, of course, like almost every open world game in existence, have a horse, which you can switch out or get better saddles for to improve its overall speed. There was a viral clip of this game's horse galloping animations going around because of how bad and silly it looked, and yeah, it didn't look very realistic at all, but I'm not sure what they did, whether it was bugged and they fixed it, or they made an all-new animation, because it looks so much better now. There isn't necessarily parkour in this game, like what you'd see in a series like Assassin's Creed. It's more similar to Ghost of Tsushima, where you can vault and climb up and over ledges and such. There were certain times where I felt like there was a particular object or ledge that I should have been able to vault, but couldn't. But aside from that, movement feels good. And the cities are even designed in a way where you can almost purely travel by rooftop, jumping from building to building, using the grappling hook and glider. I really enjoyed moving through cities this way. They have good traversal design, which only goes to enrich the exploration experience. Rise of the Ronin's scale was far bigger than I was expecting when heading into it. I had foolishly thought the starting world in Yokohama was the extent of this game's open world, and I thought, okay, this is pretty impressive. Then I reached Edo and Kyoto and realized just how big this game truly was. Every time I thought it was going to end, it kept going. And with new worlds to accommodate each new chapter in the game, it kept it feeling fresh, as each world and city have visual differences and design, although like I said, the lack of NPC density can make some of the cities feel rather bland. This game also has a lot of open world activities and side content to do, though the quality of it varies. It definitely has the Ubisoft-like open world design and side content, with a large handful of mostly forgettable side quests. Although some of them were fun and memorable, there's the classic outposts, and lots of them, where you just have to kill everyone within it. Very simple, there's not a lot of variety to these other than the amount of enemies, but they're always fun to clear out. I did particularly enjoy the character quests though. It's a bit of a hybrid between main story content and your typical side quest, as these are extra optional quests you can do with the characters you'll meet in the main story, to not only learn about them, but improve your bond and relationship with them as well. They felt a lot more important and worthwhile than your typical side quest, especially with this game's bond system. Rise of the Ronin places a very heavy emphasis on establishing bonds with characters you meet within the main story. You'll start at the first level of bond, acquaintance, and through giving them gifts, talking to them, saying the right things, and completing their quests, you'll improve your bond, which gives you unique rewards for each level, and for some of the characters, this can eventually lead to a veiled vow to establish a romantic connection to the character. The bonds are a very interesting, ambitious system that I overall liked, but I do think it could do with some improvements, perhaps in Team Ninja's next game. I wish the bond level you're at with a character would more significantly impact your interactions with them. The dialogue and how they respond to you only changes when you're in a veiled vow with them. More tangible differences with characters you have a higher bond level with, in comparison to a lower level bond, would have been nice. After all, I expect people who are fated to each other to interact in a different way than mere acquaintances. I also wish it was implemented in a more immersive, realistic way. You spam them with gifts and purposely choose the nicest option in dialogue to improve the bond and see a relationship meter move up. It's a very video gamey way of growing a bond with a character, and I wanted it to feel a bit more natural and nuanced, like more dialogue options to pick from that suit that specific character's personality and what they would respond well to, rather than easily choosing the obvious nice or flirty dialogue options. It would have been better to have to think a little bit more about what the best possible things to say to this specific character would be, based on who they are and how they act. There is some of that in some of the dialogue options, but I wanted more, because a lot of the time I didn't feel myself growing more connected and truly bonding with these characters. It often felt very forced and easy to suddenly become their best friend, where I think other RPGs have done this a lot better, like Cyberpunk, Witcher, Baldur's Gate. Now, those are all some incredible games with huge budgets and studios behind them, and it's probably not fair to compare Rise of the Ronin to those, but I do think the bond system is a really cool idea that could be something great if expanded upon and fleshed out further. So if Team Ninja does make another game in which a bond system would fit, I hope to see it return and even more improved. But outside of those quests, you have more standard open world stuff to do. Petting cats, praying at shrines, mini games, killing fugitives, doing favors for people. You even get a camera for taking photos of landmarks and completing specific missions. It's a very standard kind of open world design I've seen in dozens of games at this point. It's not bad, there's just not a whole lot about it that's very innovative, except for the online component. When connected to the internet while playing this game, you can stumble upon other players' characters as wandering AI Ronin and their pilgrim dogs. You can fight people's characters for some of their gear, and pet their dogs, which gives you some silver, and them some gifts when they return to their longhouse. And if another player dies inside one of the outposts, there'll be a prisoner for you that you can free to have them help you. This was cool, I liked this a lot. From what I understand, there was something similar in the Neo games with the Revenant system. It's a way of connecting players in the open world, even though it's largely a single-player game, and getting to see different people's unique builds and fight against them is fun, and who doesn't love petting the pilgrim dogs? While you do need an internet connection for this to work, it's not necessary. You can still play the game offline perfectly fine. It's cool because I haven't seen much like this in all the open world games I've played. The closest thing to it I can think of is how you can avenge other online players who died near you in some of the AC and Middle-earth games, but that's rather shallow in comparison to this. I like the sense of community these features bring as well. Players help each other out not only in gameplay, but with loot too. There's live world events as well, where you'll need to save a merchant from some bandits, duel a teacher's pupil, or chase down a thief, etc. These are fun little bite-sized activities, similar to what you'd see in other open world games. My only complaint with these was the amount of times they repeat themselves. I would find the exact same world event what felt like dozens of times by the end, either in the same spot or somewhere else. Same voice lines, same activity, and that got repetitive.
Is there anyone with confidence in their martial skills? Would you care to give my pupil a lesson? How you handled my pupil's attacks and threw him off balance was truly impressive. Is there anyone with confidence in their martial skills?
Although some world events would catch me off guard with this by putting a twist on it. For example, there was this one world event where a man needed help dealing with a brute causing trouble in the town, and after doing this exact event multiple times, I expected the same thing, only this time the man led me straight into an ambush with all of his friends. Granted, it didn't end well for him. It still caught me off guard though. Little wrinkles and variety like that was nice, and I wish there was more of it for world events. The Longhouse is like your home base. Here you get to send off your pilgrim dogs, send the cats you find on special missions, do some gardening for materials, talk to characters who just pop by. You can do some very light interior decorating, and engage with the game's transmog system, which I always appreciate in these games, so you can look your best without having to sacrifice stats. And this game has a lot of great customization options. I do wish there were some more samurai armor sets and colors for the outfits, but those are just nitpicks. It's here where you also get to access Testament of the Soul, which allows you to go back in time to previous regions or missions to complete or replay content. This is a fantastic quality of life feature to have, and gives the game so much more replayability. So many modern games lack good mission replay options, and so seeing this in Rise of the Ronin was really refreshing. However, one thing that does harm immersion of this world are the HUD options, or rather lack thereof. Depending on the game, I usually like to tune the HUD to make it a bit more minimal for more immersive and natural exploration. This game, similar to the new Assassin's Creed games, marks everything for you on the map and the compass, kind of taking away that wonder and natural exploration of finding things on your own in the world. There are still some unique areas you can stumble upon that aren't marked anywhere on the map, and that's fun to do, but for the most part, the game does a lot of hand-holding. And so I was hoping to maybe turn off the compass or minimize more of the HUD to get that experience I prefer. Again, I know not everyone likes to play that way, but the HUD options make this impossible. The horse control tutorial window also pops up every time you get on a horse. It takes up a decent chunk of the screen, and it doesn't fade away. I think I know how to control the horse 70 hours in, game. Furthermore, there's no way to turn this off in the HUD without turning off the HUD completely. Same thing with the compass, which I didn't want to do because seeing your own health and ki, along with the enemies, is important in this game. I don't consider this an absolutely massive game-breaking issue, but it's just odd that it won't give you much fine control over a lot of these HUD elements. Hopefully this is something that can be added through updates. And that seems like a very trivial issue in comparison to what is probably my least favorite part of this game, the gear and loot system. Chances are, if you've played a lot of RPGs, you know exactly what this is, especially if you've played a game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey that has an incredibly bloated gear system. Only with Rise of the Ronin, a lot of the gear and weapons you pick up will be duplicates of each other, but they'll just be different rarities and have different little stats. Some people may love this, and power to you, but I hate this kind of loot system. It requires a lot of inventory and gear management, and not the fun kind. I'm talking about the kind where you have to spend like 5 to 10 minutes just marking all these items to sell and disassemble, because you get overwhelmed with so much gear so quickly. And I don't find gear hoarding and dumping for coins and materials to be very fun. You'll also have to often switch out your gear and weapons for the one with the higher stats. It's just very bloated, and there's not enough distinct differences in the gear to justify all the loot. Again, especially when you're just getting copies of the same gear with a different color and number attached to it. If they had toned the amount of gear down, I would have enjoyed this game so much more. It's not so much the RPG gear and loot system that I had a problem with, Though, to be honest, I don't think a game like this really needed it. It could have just been like Ghost of Tsushima, where the focus is around upgrading the gear and weapons to be stronger, while you can change the cosmetic look of it, instead of having different rarities and versions of the same weapons. I would have much preferred that personally, but even if they just toned down the amount of gear you're bombarded with, it would have been more tolerable. You can upgrade weapons, so at least if you find one you really like, you can keep it for a while. However, upgrading takes quite a lot of materials and coins, and with how often I was finding better versions of the weapon I already had, upgrading never felt very worth it. As I mentioned, every weapon has certain perks and little boosts to them. Most of them are very small, like increased damage percentage when in an unruly area, or 2% less ki consumption when guarding. I did pay attention to these, and I tried to create a good build with them, especially with the bond transfers you can do that bring perks over from other weapons, but I never necessarily felt these perks' effects in gameplay. Like, I knew I had them, but I couldn't really tell much of a difference in combat because a lot of them are so inconsequential. I wish there were more unique sets of perks for the weapons that have a more noticeable impact on gameplay. There are certain sets of armor and weapons you can put together for bigger benefits, but those are also only pure stat boosts. Some people really like to micromanage their stats and create these builds, and I'm sure those kinds of people would enjoy this, but to me it felt more like an annoyance and a waste of time that could have been spent with the game's incredible combat. It's kind of a similar deal with the skill tree. A lot of the skills just provided minor stat boosts and increased percentages. These are still more significant and noticeable, and there are actually some added gameplay mechanics, tools, and special abilities for you to unlock with those too. The skill tree is divided up into 4 categories: strength, dexterity, charm, and intelligence. It's all pretty self-explanatory for what each one specializes in. You can focus on certain categories to try and create a build. Again, you'll even choose a blade sharpening origin at the beginning, but by the end, I had most of the skills unlocked, so it didn't necessarily feel like I was sacrificing one attribute for another. And the variety in a build comes more from the kinds of weapons you use than how you build your character through the skill tree. I put most of my focus into strength and dexterity, as those two have the biggest impact on gameplay. However, with charm and intelligence, there's a lot of useful skills as well that will get you extra dialogue options, discounted prices at stores, a higher refill of your tools and ammo, etc. Each attribute has unique skill points that can only be used for that attribute. These are a bit harder to come by, but can be earned through leveling up, purchasing them, or a reward for increasing your bond level with some of the characters. This game does have a leveling system, but it doesn't feel quite as important as some other RPGs. You gain levels by acquiring karma from killing enemies and completing quests. At the beginning, there will be some enemies that are too high of a level for you that are not meant to be fought, but as you progress through the game and you're leveling up through all the missions and side content, you'll rarely find yourself underleveled. If anything, you'll probably be overleveled for a lot of it. Something I really noticed about Rise of the Ronin overall, when it comes to things like the gear system, some of the side content, and even the story, which we'll get into in a little bit, it just has a lot of unnecessary filler and bloat that feels like it exists for the sake of extra content. Had it trimmed a lot of that down to be a leaner, more focused game, it would have been so much better than it already is. That definitely extends to the story. I won't be addressing any spoilers for the story, as I know some people watching this may not have played the game, but I am going to give my general thoughts on it. Rise of the Ronin is a very narrative-heavy game. The gameplay is what people are likely playing it for, but there is still a prevalent story here with a lot of cutscenes. And if I had to sum up that story in one word, it would be messy. In terms of pure spectacle, it looks great. It has a lot of cool moments, good voice acting, camera work, music, choreography. The duels in particular look awesome. They're so fast-paced, fluid, and flashy. There's tons of over-the-top flair and style. All of that stuff is good, and the story has a lot of epic moments, but it lacks substance. The actual plot and character writing feels messy and inconsistent. First of all, I think it really overstays its welcome. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the intro is phenomenal. I was really into the story in the first hour or so, but man, this thing drags at times. It's very long, and quite frankly, a lot of it is pretty boring until you get to one of those cool moments with all the spectacle to distract you from how hollow most of it is. Similar to the Gear system, it's just such a bloated story, it feels like it needed a bunch of filler arcs to pad out the game's runtime. The premise at the beginning is very simple. You need to find and rescue your Blade Twin, but that focus the game had at the beginning is very quickly lost as it goes in a million different directions. Your protagonist is wanting to save their Blade Twin, but they get taken on hundreds of different side adventures and are constantly getting sidetracked from what the whole premise and goal is supposed to be. This game also has so many characters. Too many. Way too many. They stuff so many characters into this thing that it's very hard to remember them all, and because there's so many, a lot of them feel very one-dimensional and haven't had the time to be fleshed out. It's like they'd rather have 50 one-dimensional characters than a few three-dimensional ones that get lots of screen time and development. And again, that's another reason why I had such a hard time caring about or connecting to a lot of them. I generally liked some of the characters because they had fun and entertaining personalities, but that was it. It was more surface level. Very few of them had any kind of depth I found interesting. It is cool how the story incorporates a lot of historical figures and events into the narrative, like Ryoma Sakamoto, Genzui Kusaka, Yoshinobu Tokugawa, Ernest Satao, and many more. Again, that's another thing it has in common with Assassin's Creed, that connection to real history. But most of the characters felt shallow. I thought the Blue Demon was a really cool looking and sounding antagonist. He had great screen presence, but even he didn't have a ton of depth to him. And the game's primary antagonist, which I won't spoil who it is, but they had the most shallow motivation of them all. I'm also not a big fan of how they went about doing the protagonist. We play as this nameless, veiled edge assassin that's clearly meant to be a self-insert for the player, who's mostly mute throughout the game, but sometimes isn't, which felt like a weird choice. They even have us pick the character's voice in the character creator, but they speak so rarely throughout the game. In fact, when my character did speak, it was very jarring, because they hadn't said anything in like 20 hours, and now they're suddenly spouting off sentences of dialogue. It's just a very weird choice. Mute protagonists can work very well for RPGs, and in games like this where there are choices, but this weird blend of being like 95% of the time mute and 5% voiced, I'm not a fan of. Again, I struggled to connect to my own main character, as they're usually supposed to be that anchor that the story is being presented to us through. Typically, you'd want the player's motivations and goals to be aligned to the protagonist's as well, but I never really felt that connection to the Blade Twin. The story was telling me how important that bond between Blade Twins was, but I didn't feel it. It makes me think this would have been more effective had the protagonist been fully voiced. Rise of the Ronin is a choice-based story, with lots of dialogue options and decisions to make, but the choices weren't quite as impactful as I initially thought, because the developers wanted to keep the events of the story in line with real history, so many of the choices don't impact the story in major ways, which kind of makes me wonder if choices were even necessary for a game like this to begin with, as you can't influence many of the biggest moments anyway. A big part of your choices as well is choosing at various times when to side with the shogunate or anti-shogunate factions. This can affect certain missions, and you'll get different rewards for your allegiance to both. Although which one you primarily choose, once again, didn't play as big of a role in the story as I would have thought. What I do like about it though, is that it makes the choice between choosing which faction you want to help very difficult. Each side has lots of good and bad. They each want what's best for Japan, but have different means of accomplishing that. It definitely makes it a hard choice where there is no clear good or evil, and you have several characters you'll meet and potentially like on both sides. But this story overall to me was a very mixed bag. I love the setting and its incorporation of historical events and figures. It was especially interesting to me since I didn't know a lot about this period, yet it was extremely important. There were some great cinematic moments, and the overall production value was really good, but the story's pacing, characters, and general plot lacks focus, consistency, and substance. This isn't really a game you play for the narrative, but with how prevalent it is, I was hoping for something stronger. Despite Rise of the Ronin's many issues, it was a game I still had a really good time with overall. I really think it could have been significantly better if it cut down on the bloat and didn't try to be so many different games and genres at once. I feel a smaller, more focused experience would have worked a lot better, because there's so many good features in this game, especially with the gameplay, but things like the gear loot system and the story hold it back from being that masterpiece level game it had the potential to be. But when all is said and done, it's an incredibly fun game, and I guess that's what matters the most. I don't think it deserved a lot of the negativity it was getting, though it is still far from a perfect game. I think it's a game a lot of people would actually find themselves enjoying if they keep an open mind and give it a fair shot, especially to a lot of my subscribers who really enjoy Assassin's Creed. I think they'll enjoy this. I definitely want to replay this game whenever it comes to PC though. But with that said, that concludes my thoughts on Rise of the Ronin. Let me know in the comments if you found the video helpful, or your thoughts on the game if you've played it. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like, consider subscribing if you're new, and other than that, thank you for watching, and have a great rest of your day.